Hello, and welcome to the Waypoint Podcast, the podcast where every week we go over the weekly Torah portion. This week is Vayetzei, and we go over some insights and little nuggets and see what the Torah is trying to tell us this week. So, as I said, this week's portion is Vayetzei. We start in chapter 28, verse 10. This is the famous Jacob's ladder, of course. Fun little fact, most prayer siddurim, I think all actually, are modeled after the Jacob's ladder model, which does come from this chapter. But this portion really focuses on Jacob as a whole, primarily with the dispute between his two wives, Leah and Rachel. So Jacob loves Rachel, right? He meets her and he decides, well, he cuts a deal with Laban to work for Rachel for 7 years. He does his 7 years. Everyone knows how the story goes. He actually gets tricked into marrying Leah, and then he has a problem with Laban about it, and so eventually he does get Rachel and also agrees to work another 7 years for Rachel's, for both of his daughters. And the story does not end there. That starts a whole family dispute that continues to go and go, primarily between the two wives themselves. And my compatriot Brad has a wonderful lesson on that very topic, so I will let him take that particular area. But I'll continue through our little short summary of the whole portion here. Jacob also ends up working for Laban over his flocks for another 6 years. And Jacob, in this particular scene here, kind of tricks Laban a little bit for some sheep. And if you read this portion, you can see what happens there. But moving on really quickly, Jacob eventually secretly leaves Laban. He just sort of packs up and goes. Laban eventually confronts Jacob. He kind of chases after him. He catches up and then confronts him, and they have a bit of an argument. And eventually they kind of come to terms and they cut another deal. And they sort of call it quits after that between the two of them. And that sort of about wraps it up for the portion. There's a lot going on between Jacob and Laban, and also a lot going on between Rachel and Leah in this particular portion. And so, with that being said, that's your short little overview for the week's portion. Now I will turn it over to my compatriot Brad, who has prepared a very insightful message for you for this week, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everyone. Allow me to personally welcome you to the Waypoint Podcast. This week, we have decided to call the episode War of the Roses, and it's kind of a funny little nod off to historians and others who are aware of something that happens pretty kind of at the middle point in this parsha. But in chapter 30, verse 14, in a Jewish version, it says that Reuben went in the days of the wheat harvest, and he found Dudayim in the field, and brought them to Leah, his mother. And Rachel said, "Now give me some of your son's Dudayim." Now, for those of you who don't know, Dudayim means wildflower. Some of your translations in English may say mandrakes. The actual word just means wildflower. Nobody's really even sure what kind of flowers they were. There's actually quite a bit of rabbinic dispute over the matter in the Talmud. But in any case, when we continue reading in verse 15, Leah says back, "Is it a small matter that you have taken my husband, that you wish also to take my son's Dudayim?" So Rachel said, "Therefore he shall sleep with you tonight as payment for your son's Dudayim." Now, this is why we've called it the War of the Roses. We're actually going to discuss a few things leading up to this point, and then continue a little beyond this point. So obviously, there's a dispute between these sisters. They have married the same husband. And growing up personally, I was always told, hey, you should always view it from the other person's perspective. And then I was always presented with what would have been Leah's perspective. Naturally, given our modern idea of monogamy, we tend towards pity of the first wife. Even though it was an unfair circumstance, as a matter of fact, the unfairness of the circumstance tends us even more so to view the situation from Leah's side. And the way that I was brought up kind of just assumed that Rachel's side was the one that we would naturally take. And so we had to go out of our way to view this from Leah's side. But I was never actually presented with a blow-by-blow of how Rachel might have viewed this situation. So that's what we're going to do today. Because as much pity as we may want to take on Leah, what I discovered reading through it this time around is that some of her behavior is actually very unbecoming. So how it begins is obviously they marry the same husband, and then we get into the sons being born. Now, think about this from from Rachel's perspective. She is already marrying a man who has another wife. Matter of fact, it was rather commonplace in this time, in this area, for a man to have more than one wife. That's where part of the disconnect with us in the modern era comes in. So Rachel is already accepting the fact that her husband has another wife. This is, in particular, what Leah seems to struggle with the most. It's kind of that whole, the firstborn doesn't really learn to share the same way as his younger siblings, because for the firstborn, for at least a part of their life, they're an only child. They never had to share. Whereas any sibling who came after the firstborn, they have never known a time where they didn't have to share. And we kind of see that play out here. So the first son that Leah has, she names Reuven, means behold a son. And there are any number of ways that we can read this. Most of the ways that I have presented are kind of just a grateful is like, oh, hey, it's wonderful, I had a son. But given the greater whole of Leah's attitude in this parsha, it doesn't really seem that way. It's actually more like bragging, like, ha, see, I gave Jacob a son, right? Because she is constantly comparing herself to Rachel throughout this dynamic. And it's kind of bragging that she was the first to give their husband an heir. The next son she named Simeon, which means heard, as in the statement, God has heard me. So she's even invoking the Almighty is now taking her side on this issue. She's fighting this holy war with God on her side. Then she names her third Levi. Levi seems to be staking a claim, right? It's I've given him 3 sons, so he's mine, right? There's a very possessive nature that we get from Leah over Jacob in this. One thing noteworthy here, that doesn't seem to be the case with Judah. With Judah, it's kind of like she just puts all that aside and just praises Hashem for the sake of her 4th son, right? She has a 4th son. His name is Judah. And the interesting thing about this is that these first 3 sons that she seems to have used almost as weapons, they are cast out of the line of succession, right? Naturally, Reuben would have been Jacob's heir, and then in the line of succession, you would have had Simeon and Levi. All 3 of those fell out of the line of succession, which is why Judah ended up being the heir to Jacob. And I don't think it's inconsequential that this has taken the path that it has, and they ultimately ended up in that vein. I think a lot of the way that we treat our children can have an effect on what they ultimately become. And in this case, Leah is treating her children as weapons. And think about that from Rachel's perspective. Like, this whole time, you're aware that your husband has this other wife, and you're accepting it for what it is. But she, on the other hand, has this melodramatic woe is me attitude about the whole situation, when the fact is neither of you had any choice in the matter. And that's a fact that needs to be explained. We often treat it like Rachel had a choice and Leah didn't. but that's not the case. If Laban had the authority to command Leah to marry Jacob, then he also had that authority to command Rachel to marry Jacob. Neither of them had a choice. And again, we see Rachel kind of accept this fact. Matter of fact, she even uses this to her advantage. She sees that Leah is having children. She's not having children. So she gives Jacob a third wife, right? She gives him her handmaiden, kind of like Sarah. Rachel, through this whole scenario, actually exhibits an attitude more like Sarah. And this, we see it manifest in totality. And so she has children via this handmaiden. And their names are Dan, right? Dan means judge. And this is read sort of in a sense of Rachel understanding some sense of vindication, or even alternatively that God has judged her. That interpretation kind of follows this idea that she married another woman's husband, and so God's judging her for it. I'm not a fan of that one, again, because she doesn't seem to have any choice in the matter. So she's reading some sense of vindication into this. And then she names the second son Naphtali, which means struggle. Now, this is where a lot of people say that Rachel is the one who essentially is initiating this divine combat of childbearing. But I don't see that, again, because Leah's attitude is made very apparent prior to Rachel having any children. At this point, Rachel is just calling it what it is. She's acknowledging that this dispute is happening. So she names this son Naphtali, which means struggle, because she's recognizing the struggle that she's in with her sister. So, on through the rest of this parasha, right? This is the point after the birth of Naphtali that this incident with the Dudayim happens, and then they barter for Leah's time with Jacob. Now, prior to this, Leah also did give over her handmaiden to Jacob. And she also had two sons. So Leah, seeing that she didn't have any children, it's almost interesting. It's like she's recognizing that maybe God's not on her side anymore. So she makes the choice to give her handmaiden to Jacob. And she also has two sons. The first one being Gad, which means fortune, right? It's like, oh, how fortunate that another son has come about. And then also Asher, which is happy, you could say. It's almost also a declaration of victory in this struggle, because she says, my name will be remembered among women because of my fortune. Right? There's a lot of self-centeredness in Leah here. And then we see that God again allows Leah to conceive after this whole wildflowers incident. And the first child she names is Issachar. She names this child Issachar, which means reward. And the statement, it's almost like she recognized the lesson she was supposed to be learning, because she specifically says, God has rewarded me because I gave my husband, my servant, for a wife. So it's like she acknowledges that her own possessiveness over Jacob, right? Through this whole narrative, she's got this, he's my husband. You've stolen from me. He belongs to me. He belongs with me. Right. And that seems to be the struggle she's supposed to get over. And it's almost like she recognizes that, because she recognizes that this son is a reward for the fact that she has now learned to share her husband. And that may seem like a really weird concept to think about, but that ultimately is what the text is leading us to. And then she has the son Zebulun, which is very similar to her naming of Levi, means exalted. Or also the idea is that now Jacob would dwell with her because she gave him 6 sons. Very similar to the idea of naming Levi so because she gave him 3 sons. So now her husband would be attached to her. And then after that, she has Dinah also. And what I find interesting about this is that we get no idea as to why Dinah is called Dinah, right? Dinah means judge also. Like Dan, Dinah, yeah, sure. Um, and it's interesting. The rabbis note this too. In the Talmud, there's discussion over why Dinah is called Dinah, and essentially it's the idea that Leah recognized that if she gave Jacob 7 sons, then her sister Rachel wouldn't even be equal to the maidservants in terms of having provided tribes for Jacob. It operates under the assumption that she was already aware that Jacob would give rise to 12 tribes. Um, and so in that moment of realization, it's like God judged and determined that that child would be a female, so that Rachel could also give forth 2 children to at least put her on an even level with the handmaidens, because the handmaidens had 2 children apiece. And that is the point at which we also see that God remembers Rachel and gives her children. Now, what's the takeaway from this? The attitude we see in Leah is a very immature, very possessive, very selfish attitude, whereas what we see in Rachel is, again, we see her exhibit kind of the attitude of Sarah. She seems to have just accepted the fact that they're in an unfortunate situation where they're married to the same husband. But Leah doesn't accept this. She has a very hard time accepting this. Again, there's that possessiveness over Jacob. And interestingly enough, later in the Parsha, we actually see where she gets this from. When Jacob finally chooses to take his leave, in Genesis 31:43, and Laban catches up to him, what does Laban say, right? Jacob says, look, I worked with you for 20 years. You've changed my wages so many times, and I had enough, so it was time to leave. And Laban says, the daughters are my daughters, the sons are my sons, the animals are my animals, and all that you see is mine. So we see where Leah gets this attitude from. The takeaway I see is this. Both Jacob, in the case of Laban, and Rachel, in the case of Leah, acted more adult. And that kind of is really what hit me with this. That looks at situation. Sometimes you're in an unfair situation. And oftentimes this is going to involve a struggle with another human being. And maybe that other human being is not being the adult, but somebody's got to be the adult. For there to be peace, somebody has to be the adult. And that is what we learn from the examples of Rachel and Jacob in this particular parsha. That's the takeaway for me. It's kind of a really long way of getting around to it, but it seems to just be staring you in the face when you consider the attitude exhibited by the others. So with that, I certainly hope that this has blessed and educated you, and I will hand it back over to my compatriot.
Hello and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. I know it's a little bit more convoluted, I guess, than maybe we're used to. There's a lot of details going on here, and there's a lot of things to consider. And so for my final thoughts, I kind of want to help sort of clear some things, at least the best that I can. Because once again, we're talking about a situation which we can't really relate to in the modern era. But the takeaway for me, hearing Brad's lesson again, is after the War of the Roses, going back to our title, after the thing of the Mandrakes, the Dudayim, what have you, that's where we begin to see the changes between Rachel and Leah. And I'm going to name drop. He's not paying us to say this, but Rabbi David Foreman has an excellent teaching called Rachel's Tears. It's about this particular parasha, and he talks about Leah and Rachel's perspectives, as Brad has already told you. And so I think combining the two of these together sort of gives us the idea that, everyone has to be able to see each other's perspective in order to gain an understanding. As Brad opened up with, oftentimes we're told to try and see it from the other person's perspective. And that certainly helps us to understand and be better at making decisions or not judging somebody so quickly, or, what have you, in any number of applications that could have. But for the peace to really be brought, one person doing all of the effort isn't quite going to do it. And so it's not until after the War of the Roses, so to speak, where both sisters seem to have come to an understanding of each other. In my view, Leah seems that, she got to marry Jacob first, and whether Rachel likes it or not, Rachel chose to continue to pursue a marriage where Leah sort of already laid claim. And so Leah feels like she's entitled to her husband. It was her wedding, even though it really wasn't really meant for her to begin with. So Leah also feels robbed of really being married to Jacob without that deception. And likewise, Rachel, same thing. She sort of feels robbed of her real marriage without that deception. It sort of put a real damper on everything, and nothing went, according to plan. And Rachel, for all intents and purposes, she continued to be long-suffering. She continued to be very patient. She even allows her sister to go through with the wedding. If you've read the Mishnah, you're aware of the signs. Some of you may know what I'm talking about, but essentially she allows Leah to get into this marriage. So she's okay with the situation of sharing, and yet there still seems to be this animosity. And it comes from a lack of coming together and having that confrontation together and coming to an understanding from both perspectives. What we appear to see is that they didn't have that talk until after that moment. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Of course, that means our takeaway is, as sort of seems kind of simple, but yeah, talk, communicate. Somebody has to at least initiate the conversation, and that could be us. Who knows? Anyway, thank you very much for joining us this week on the Waypoint Podcast. I hope you've enjoyed the lesson here for this week, and have a wonderful rest of your week. We shall see you next week. Shalom. Special thanks to this month's Patreon supporters: